now. Detonate the reality bomb!
I will build a great, great wall.
Some alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The 7 mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
North Korea has promised to give up its nukes. We still don't know what happened in Syria and what is really going on with the changes in the relationship between the United States and China. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel, it's youtube.com/Derek Gilbert. Please subscribe. Click the little button in the bottom right-hand corner there. You'll get an update, an email every time we post a new video, whether it's for this program or our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, or PID Radio, which we are now posting to YouTube as well. No video, just the audio, but if you're a regular YouTube user, then you'll get a notification there as well. Again, we appreciate your subscriptions and, of course, your thumbs up and reviews wherever fine podcasts are sold, whether it's Spreaker, Stitcher, or at the iTunes podcast store. vftb.net is the website. You'll find the show notes there. And our guest this week, and thanks, by the way, special thanks to Tom Horn of Skywatch TV, because he has been very gracious about allowing me from time to time to use audio from programs that we've recorded for Skywatch TV for the podcast. I try not to do that too often. I don't want to take advantage of the relationship, but also because I don't want to duplicate the programming that we're doing at Skywatch TV. I want View from the Bunker to stand on its own. We've been producing the program since 2009, and we're at 396 episodes or something thereabouts. So we've done quite a lot of content here on this program, apart from what we do at Skywatch TV. But we had some recent conversations with our next guest that will be broadcast as Skywatch TV web exclusives. You'll also find that at the Skywatch TV mobile app. And the content is so good that I wanted to take the audio and put it together as one long program. We've got several different topics, generally speaking: Syria, Russia and China, and what is going on as we try to figure out how to proceed from here forward with North Korea. Our guest is an expert in foreign policy, especially as it relates to the Middle East. He is a career military officer and still consults for the Pentagon. Also a senior fellow with the Family Research Council, and the published author of several books that we highly recommend, including Never Submit, Future War, and The Deeper State. So it's our honor to welcome back to the program Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis. The civil war in Syria has taken some really ugly turns. We've seen some atrocities from all sides, and it's as much an information war as anything else. Who knows what we can trust coming out of Syria, because you've got various groups with vested interest in making us think that their side is the one that's telling the truth. What is your assessment of the situation there? I mean, the use of chemical weapons in Douma, did it happen? Didn't it happen? If so, who would benefit from it? The response by the president, what all is going on there, and how do we go? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, it is a complex environment. To the north, you have the Turks that are fighting the Kurds, which they consider terrorists, and of course, we're supporting the Kurds who fight for us and help defeat ISIS. You have Al Qaeda there. You have maybe 100 different Islamist groups. Right. You have the Quds Force, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. You have the Russians that are embedded. And then, of course, you have the regime. Mm-hmm. And, of course, to the southwest, the Israelis are occasionally popping some people inside of air bases because of the incursions by the Iranians and others. And Hezbollah's in the mix as well. That, we've known for ages that the Syrians have had a significant arsenal of chemical and biological, and they even had a nuclear facility that the Israelis bombed years ago. Mm-hmm. North Koreans, by the way, were helping them with that. More recently, in 2013, President Obama, working with Vladimir Putin, said, we're going to remove all these dirty weapons, and they're going to go elsewhere. Well, guess what? It didn't happen. Time and again, we've been finding that Bashar Assad, the president of Syria, has used his thugs to employ chlorine gas, perhaps mustard, perhaps sarin nerve agent, against innocent men, women, and civilians and others, allegedly fighting ISIS, but that's not really the case. Much less the Russians aren't fighting ISIS. The Russians are fighting for Assad to preserve the regime. Mm-hmm. And so, the question is, when you had the recent attack on Douma on the 7th of April, was that really the Assad regime? Now, of course, I heard, as everyone else did, that Secretary Mattis observed, as did Chairman of the Joint Chief Joe Dunford, that there was a Syrian helicopter flying around that area, that we've seen canisters that appear to be chlorine canisters. The symptoms of the people on the ground that were killed or hurt does appear to be aligned with the use of chlorine and other agents. And so the question is, what's the motivation?
Right.
Weeks before that, President Trump said, well, I'm going to withdraw all my troops, my 2,000 troops out of there, and then we'll rely upon the Arabs and others to take care of it. That may have been, some argue, an invitation for Assad to say, now I'm free. I can do what I want. I'll take care of these people over here that aren't cooperating with me on the outskirts of Damascus. I think a different take might be, one, what do the Russians gain by this? Mm-hmm. Who might want us to stay, which would be some of the militias that clearly might have access and do this. Mm-hmm. It would not make a lot of sense for Assad to do it because there's not an upside for Assad to do this.
He's essentially already won. He's already defeated the rebels.
That's right. He has already won. And the Israelis, I don't think, in fact, the Israelis want Assad to stay because Assad may be a bad actor, but he is their bad actor trying to keep control over a disparate group of people.
They're smart enough to see what happened to Iraq after Saddam was taken out.
They are. And then, of course, what do the Iranians gain by this? I don't know that the Iranians gain much, other than, of course, they now control much of Iraq. Mm-hmm. They control mostly from the Litani River down to the Israeli border, thanks to Hezbollah, much of that region. And now they have at least 5 air bases where they have facilities around Damascus and homes and so forth. So the Iranians are doing well. Why upset the apple cart by throwing 105 precision-guided missiles from 3 nations at 3 facilities? Mm-hmm. We acknowledge that we didn't destroy his entire capability to use gases. Mm-hmm. We didn't bomb the Russians, so the Russians aren't going to leave. So we begin to wonder, if this is only about messaging, why didn't they just write it on a piece of paper and send it to Assad and say, quit that, rather than spend millions and millions of dollars as they did? I suppose the only conclusion you can come to is that we believe that this would stop Assad from doing something like this in the future. But I wonder, what are our interests in that region? And so we go back to originally what Macron and May and Trump have all said, and that is, we are concerned about the proliferation of the use of nasty materials mm-hmm. in the world. The Brits, the North Korean dictator killed his half-brother, mm-hmm. And now multiple use there. Are they proliferating elsewhere? Are the Russians proliferating elsewhere? These inventories, if they were to get into this country, would be dangerous. And we do have reason to believe. We have Hezbollah in this country. We have threats that are targeted in this country. What's even worse, much worse, than the chemical agents? Because, I know how, we have I was trained on how to deploy chemical agents many, many years ago. But it's biological stuff which North Korea has, which Syria has had, which Russia definitely has had, and the Chinese. It's the proliferation of that which I think is behind this, but nobody is saying that, even though that is the far more serious threat that we face than
biological
chemical.
agent, talking about
Clearly.
something like a weaponized Ebola or something of that.
Weaponized Ebola. And I know, the problems we have in Liberia a couple of years ago were terrible.
Yes.
Can you imagine? If we had an outbreak in one of the cities in this country.
Yeah, which we almost did just a couple of years ago with people who got on planes,
That's right.
Wound up in Cleveland and in Dallas
right.
and so forth. Yeah.
That is incredibly serious.
Right.
You just think about the outbreak of E. coli, from eating things. Well, this could easily be spread. Smallpox. Smallpox has been weaponized to a certain degree by certain nations like North Korea. Mm-hmm. We've seen the research on that and so forth. So if this were to happen, the only reasonable alternative is to quarantine an entire city and not let anybody in or out. Mm. And you can imagine the terrible circumstance that would result from doing that sort of thing. Mm. But, Ebola is an incredibly dangerous. And in Africa, we have several locations that we work on these types of, scientific efforts to understand and to control them. So these, I suspect, behind the scene, this is the sort of threat that our president, our National Security Council, they're all concerned about, and rightly so. That could wipe out an entire nation very quickly if it weren't controlled. The chemical agents, no. As noxious as chlorine gas is, as noxious as sarin gas, they dissipate very rapidly in the atmosphere. The biological elements will not. They'll spread like a wildfire.
Yeah. Wow, we could do a whole program on that. But shifting gears, because I want to get your take on this. Recently, of course, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster retired. Right. John Bolton took his place. Right. President Trump, via Twitter, announced to the world that Rex Tillerson would be stepping down as Secretary of State, and he nominated the CIA Director Mike Pompeo, former congressman from Kansas. What is your take on how this will affect American foreign policy?
Well, arguably, it will be tougher. I've known John Bolton. He's a tough guy. H.R. McMaster is... I think more progressive than certainly some others that have been in there. But Bolton, as his ideas have been well available on Fox News and in the press for years and years, and he has a very, very fixed opinion about the Iranian deal we made in 2015, a fixed opinion about Russia, about China, and it's going to be hard-nosed. And I think we have to, based upon all I understand. Pompeo, we gave Obama Hillary Clinton. We gave him Kerry. We gave him everyone else. Pompeo is a tough guy. He's a fellow West Pointer as I. He's a Harvard Law graduate, Kansas. And then, of course, he just came from the CIA, where he was a director for, since the president took over. Diplomacy, and I work with the State Department. I work with them all the time. That's a very different environment over there. It's a very different than the Pentagon where I work in terms of they're almost touchy-feely, which you have to be in diplomacy to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. I suppose that's a little bit beyond, in some cases, where I think we as the United States need to be today, because the world is so tough and it's not at all forgiving. I think of the UN when I think of our State Department in many cases, and how we've acquiesced to the likes of the diplomats of the UN to our disadvantage. So this is important that the president get the team that he wants. I think he's trying to get the team he wants. He was dealt a hand early in the administration that the established Republicans said, this is who you need to get. Mm-hmm. And so he accepted that grudgingly, recognizing full well that they were not going to get him where he needs to be in terms of controlling our borders, a strong national security, the type of economy that we want, the things that he promised to make America first. He's going to get it if he can get his team, but the Democrats at this point, especially Chuck Schumer and others, are dragging their feet and threatening not to allow Pompeo to get in there, much like a lot of the other people, because this administration has been very slow, and it's not its fault, but very slow at filling critical positions, which really jeopardizes our ability to run the country.
when we talked last year, you said that the only way forward in North Korea, the only paths forward appeared to be grim. President Trump has been talking tough about Kim Jong-un for a while, using Twitter to get his message past the filters with the mainstream media. And surprise, surprise, here recently, it was announced that CIA Director Mike Pompeo had a secret meeting with Kim Jong-un, the first unsupervised meeting, or rather meeting without delegates from South Korea there, to set up a meeting, the first ever, between the head of North Korea and a United States president to discuss their nuclear program. And following that, North Korean state media announced that they would cease testing on nuclear weapons and rockets immediately. This sounds like wonderful news. How do you read it?
Well, it is wonderful news if it's true. And that's always the problem. The reality is we spent the last 60-plus years negotiating on and off with the North Koreans, Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather, and they've all played the same trick over the years. Let's backtrack a bit. Go back to immediately following the announcement that Kim Jong-un, offered to meet with President Trump. And subsequently, the president said, okay, I'll meet with you. Then you had President Xi Jinping, the president of China, who said, well, I want you, Kim Jong-un, president, dictator of North Korea, to come over and see me in Beijing. So he, creeps by night in his secret armored train over to Beijing, the first international trip he's made since he's become the president or the chief dictator for North Korea. And then, of course, he was welcomed with all sorts of fanfare, state visit, various and sundry activities, and then he heads back. Now, the question is, what transpired between that early March meeting and the meeting or the announcement by which Kim Jong-un announces that, I'm going to abandon this sort of stuff and so forth, and, of course, Pompeo, in the interim, having visited. This is what I think happened. He sat down with, he being President Xi, sat down with Kim Jong-un and said, look, Mr. Trump is going to be in office no more than 7 more years. Okay? He'll probably be replaced by somebody that is more like perhaps Barack Obama, someone who kind of ignored what was going on here and allowed you to do your mischief. As for me, President Xi, based upon the 19th Congress back in October of 2017, and based upon the Parliament's decision to make me the leader for life, I'm going to be here a long time. And also, what's important to you understand is the year 2035. Year 2035 is when the Chinese are expected to overtake the U.S. in terms of economic power across the world. And also, by the way, I'm doing all sorts of things militarily. You have to understand, I've already taken over much of the South China Sea through the creation of these islets. I've intimidated everyone else down there. I'm now working on the Shinjuku Islands. I'm working against the Japanese, interestingly, which are not terribly favorable about the meeting that you and Mr. Trump are proposing. And I'm also intimidating Guam, which belongs to the United States. My objective is the 3-island chain. And by 2050, I intend to be in charge of most of the Pacific all the way to the Hawaiian Islands. So, you can either, make a deal with Mr. Trump that will last maybe 7 years, or you can make a deal with me that could last certainly the rest of your life. And Mr. Kim Jong-un's a relatively young man. I think there's a calculation there. And I do believe that, that has influenced what Kim Jong-un tells President Moon of South Korea, as well as what he will tell President Trump once President Trump and he agreed to a location. Now, meanwhile, you've heard post the announcement of Pompeo's visit over there that Mr. Trump is somewhat hesitant. He said, if I get into a meeting and things aren't going right, I'm going to leave. So he's received some indication that things may not go his way. And I suspect, given the history, that it won't go exactly his way. He may, in fact, never meet with Kim Jong-un. Now, I have no horse in the battle in that I do want peace. I spent a year on the demilitarized zone. I know how vicious these folks can be. I would like to have unification of the Koreas. I'd like to have peace in Northeast Asia. I just don't see it in the cards.
Continuity. That's one of the key issues here, then, I guess. The United States government has a number of continuity of government facilities where if something were really bad to happen, we would be able to continue to perform the basic functions of government in the aftermath of some disaster. Allegedly. But continuity from administration to administration is something that I think most of us Americans don't think about. We're sort of conditioned to think in 4-year cycles, whereas, as you point out, President Xi and Kim Jong-un, even in Russia, Vladimir Putin, they're not constrained by that sort of 4-year election cycle or 2-year election cycle with Congress. How would the American government continue the policies laid down under one particular president? Or is there any hope that we could establish some sort of continuity of policy from one administration to the next regarding our relationship with China, Korea?
Well, just look at the night and day difference between President Obama and President Trump. President Trump took over, basically saying, I'm going to do the opposite of what President Obama did, and I'm going to do it from day one. And he has quite a track record of doing just that. So unless there's some reality of an expectation that the person that follows President Trump, assuming he gets elected to a second term, is going to continue those policies, then, I think that President Xi and Kim Jong-un have an understanding that the best course of action is for him to look to Beijing and not to Washington for solutions. Now, the fact that Kim Jong-un has offered to denuclearize, to close down his test facility, to declare that I already have nuclear-tipped missiles, I've gone as far as I need to go, and I'm not going to sell this stuff anymore, is all a ploy. Like I said, we've seen this before. It is a dangerous thing to put all your faith in this character, because it's just like what is it on the Peanuts?
Lucy
cartoon?
with the football.
Lucy and the football.
I was thinking that very thing.
And I've used that analogy for years and years and years. Lucy always promises not to pull it, and she always does. Mm-hmm. These people have always promised, and they always do. So until we find something that says, no, it's not going to happen, he actually leaves the football there and it is kicked, then perhaps we can start to have some faith in the process.
Some of the more interesting moves that the president has done, President Trump, have involved the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, making basically saying that he would withdraw from NAFTA if Mexico didn't step up enforcement of its own borders, much less our own. And there have been some things that have happened, such as the willingness of North Korea to sit down, that may be the result of economic pressure. How would the president use our economic leverage as the world's largest economy, at least at this point, for another 15 years, 20 years, to try to get concessions that might actually stick out of North Korea?
Well, you go through China, because China provides 80 to 90% of all the supplies and the support that North Korea uses to survive. And then President Trump has made all sorts of threats and followed through with tariffs or threats of tariffs with the Chinese. And they've come to the table, and they start to provide what appear to be some concessions. And so, by playing hardball with the Chinese, I think we can leverage other things, such as North Korea, or, for that matter, relationships even with Russia or Iran or, some of the Asian nations. His meeting in coziness, President Trump's with Prime Minister Abe of Japan, is important because Abe tends to be rather skeptical about the Korean moves, and I understand that. There's not a lot of love lost in the history of Japan invading the Koreas and taking people captive, much less the Chinese. Mm-hmm. So they understand that's the third world, or the third largest economy in the world. They're very powerful, very influential. They've had their military confrontations. I suspect those are going to continue to escalate. And I know that based upon discussions with some very senior people.
North Korea seems like just a pain in the side of the world, like a splinter that you can't dig out. China certainly would have the capacity, the ability to do something about it. Why don't they?
Well, they can use it for their own purposes, their own manipulation. Keep in mind, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, when he wanted to invade in 1950 South Korea, relied upon a decision and the guidance of Stalin, who was really his primary backer. And eventually he persuaded Stalin to give the go-ahead to invade the South, and because Stalin was afraid the U.S. would join the war. And, of course, the U.S. Had nuclear weapons, had used them in Japan twice, and as a direct result, Stalin was concerned that this loose cannon called Truman might do it again. So you had those variables. I think in this particular case with President Xi, who is the primary supporter of North Korea, that there are a lot of concerns here. They want the U.S. to kind of back away, but they don't want to antagonize the Japanese. They would like to see a unified Korea, but unified Korea, it's certainly not going to be communist overall because the South is so prosperous and in comparison. So all these factors are at play here, rather complex, and how it ends up is anyone's guess at this point. But given China's long-term aims, and those are very well articulated economically and militarily. They are very hegemonic for the entire region. And I would argue, given insights that I have, that they have global aspirations that are more than economic.
We're talking with Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis, author of The Deeper State, about the geopolitical situation, mainly involving, I guess, the Pacific and the Asian world. I guess we can kind of include Russia in that because of its geography. China's goals to control the Pacific by the year 2050 is something that anyone who's lived through World War II and saw Japan's move in that direction as something that just resulted in horrific loss of life and a huge expenditure of blood and treasure by the United States to drive it back. Warfare has changed since the 1940s. How does this confrontation shape up? Looking, say, 100 years difference between the 1940s and, say, the 2040s. How do we counter this sort of and should the United States even try?
Well, we should try just because we have vested interest for our own homeland and that of our allies. There is a technological revolution taking place. There are things that are happening, as we very speak here, about the technologies that will take us into the future that are very, very frightening. A major one that the Chinese arguably are close or leading on is artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. President Xi has basically pulled together most of his intellectual people in China behind the artificial intelligence efforts. They are harnessing it not only for industrial and economic reasons, but also for military reasons. And even our own leadership, Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Development, Mr. Griffin, has made it very clear that China could very well be ahead of us on artificial intelligence and harnessing it to weapon systems. They have already put certain drone AI capabilities on surface ships. They're working on hypersonic vehicles that can destroy our aircraft carriers at long distances, which is the anti-access issue is very important. Even the new admiral that's taken over the Pacific Command has basically said that we're falling behind the Chinese in investment on high technology. They have a very sophisticated ground force. They have a navy that's almost our size, certainly a submarine force. They already floated one aircraft carrier. They're about to float in the next few years, a second and a third, and perhaps others. They have the hypersonic stuff. They have the stealth technologies. They have the space weapon platforms that we believe that they're developing to knock out our satellite systems, which we're wholly dependent upon to do expeditionary operations around the world. So when you consider all of that, and that they're spending, as much as we are, if you take into account that a lot of their expenditures are hidden within state expenditures, and they are not afraid of kind of mixing state and the civilian economy together on weapon systems and developments. So there's a lot to be concerned about.
Now, you wrote extensively about the frightening technologies that are coming online in your book, The Future War,
right.
And your statement about the long-range missiles able to knock out aircraft carriers is what comes to mind here. We've depended on our control of the sea for a long time, since World War II at least.
Absolutely.
And the aircraft carrier has played an important role in that. Right. If the advantage of the aircraft carrier is taken away, and the ability to even see from space via satellite what our troops are doing on the ground, where the enemy's located. If those are suddenly knocked out, and certainly we probably have countermeasures in place to take out enemy weapon systems that are similar to our own. In other words, the Chinese aircraft carriers are probably just as vulnerable as ours would be to these kind of missiles. It all seems like it's going to come down to the actual soldier on the ground once again. I mean, once these high-tech systems neutralize one another, it's all going to come down to boots on the ground at the end of the day.
Well, certainly that's part of the equation. Hypersonics would allow us to sit wherever we are in the world, and because a hypersonic weapon will travel perhaps 10 times the speed of sound, and will, like Vladimir Putin announced in early March at his State of the Nation, he said, we already have all these systems. Now, our strategic command commander said that, believe him, he does have the systems. Now, whether or not they're perfected or not is a different issue, but he is working. He confirmed that. And so the Chinese are doing the same thing. Will they be able to knock out our carriers? Eventually, yes. We have no air defense against a hypersonic weapon system. Will their cyber attacks, will their lasers, will their other systems that are being honed be effective? I would argue yes. So we do have to ask the question, how do we fight wars in the future? We'll use certainly cyber to destroy as much as we can. There will be space-based platforms, and China already has some, and the Russians are working. Arguably, they have a capability. I won't comment on what we may or may not be doing. So, how are you going to do this? Now, the Chinese, meanwhile, if you look across the world, the Chinese have great control over the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, certainly over the Straits of Malacca. They have all sorts of special relationships in Africa, in South America, and Central America. They're buying up port facilities in much of Europe, about 10% of the ports in Europe.
And attempting to do it here in the United States.
And they would do it here if we give them the way go ahead. So they're orchestrating globally positioning of their interests. Now, everywhere you have a Chinese interest, you have a state interest. It's not just economics. They aren't Amazon. They're the PLA, People's Liberation Army Amazon, and they're going to be located all over the globe. They're very persuasive. They control arguably 70% of the telecommunications in this world through one of their major government-sponsored franchises. to understand the scope of what we're talking about here is truly frightening, and especially if you understand the ideology of President Xi and the Chinese people. So if I were recommending someone to work on geopolitics in the future, I'd say focus on China, consider learning Chinese, Mandarin, or whatever, and then you'll be positioned pretty well, because we're going to have a lot better understanding and appreciation for who they are and what they want.
Sounds to me as though North Korea serves as a junkyard dog for China.
It's a proxy. If you look back at World War, certainly the Cold War, we had proxy fights. We had a proxy fight in Korea initially, a proxy fight in Vietnam, and we had proxy fights elsewhere in Africa and the Middle East. We will have proxy fights in the future. I would argue the fight in Syria is a proxy fight, and what I argue is the new Cold War. There are the proxy fights probably in Northeast Asia. There will be proxy fights in Southeast Asia, certainly in Oceania, which are all those island groupings throughout South China Sea and the Eastern Indian Ocean. And then, of course, they're building facilities not just at Djibouti in northeastern Africa. We have a couple of new Chinese facilities off the coast of Pakistan. And, of course, the Paks are not friendly with the Indians, and the Chinese are now very cozy with the Pakistanis, which worries the Indians. The world is becoming far more chaotic than it's ever been.
And all three of those nations are nuclear armed.
They are.
Yeah. My dad once said, based on his experience working in the electronics industry with Motorola, which had a number of dealings with Japanese and other Asian suppliers, that he characterized the difference between the American worldview and the Asian worldview like the difference between a ballet and a hockey game. With the ballet, the Asians take a very long view. Everything is carefully orchestrated, and there are ebbs and flows and crescendos, but they always know where they are in the ballet, and it's always building toward a conclusion. Whereas Americans are always looking, how many seconds do we have left in the period? Time to pull the goalie, throw everything out there to try to make our goal for the end of the quarter. But it seems that this is also an apt metaphor for politics.
Oh, it is.
And the way we view our foreign policy here in the United States. Everything is geared on a 2 or 4 year cycle, whereas our Asian brothers and sisters, the Chinese especially, seem to take a much, much longer view and much more consistency from year to year.
Yeah, if you go back thousands of years and you have the Silk Road, which was basically linking the Asian world with the European world, that ended to a certain degree because of the bubonic plague.
Right.
And the fact that...
which was spread in part by the Silk Road.
It was. But today there's a new Silk Road.
Yeah.
And President Xi started in 2013 that adventure, investing trillions of dollars across the world. And it's spread to at least 68 countries, and his ambition is well over 100 countries, to have wrestled control. He's doing that through port facilities. He's doing it through even the forward manning of his armed forces. This is a global march, and the sooner we understand the competition, the better off we'll be.
The resistance to President Trump and what he's trying to accomplish, there are some forces working behind the scenes here in the United States or around the world that also have a long-term goal in mind. What is that goal? Why are they opposed to President Trump? And how closely do those goals match what, say, the Chinese or the Russians are trying to accomplish?
Well, certainly the globalists, which I talk about in the deeper state, are part of this whole worldwide agenda. Globalists, in a very general sense, it seems to be a bit generic or non-confrontational. In other words, the international communication, which is nice, international markets, and certainly ideas about respect for human rights, the promotion of this and that. But it's also about tearing down borders, which Mr. Trump, in his campaign in 2016, made it very clear that he opposes the attacks on sovereignty. He opposes, open markets where it destroys the American economy, takes jobs away from us, takes manufacturing away from us, and puts it in the hands of the Chinese. For instance, we can't build a jet in this country without chips. from China, because China dominates that field, and they dominate a lot of areas. And so you have Mr. Trump saying, look, I'm going to protect the sovereignty of America first, and it's not, anything goes and the Chinese are going to rule the world sort of thing, which is often what the conclusion comes to. Certainly Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger, the old David Rockefellers, the Soros folks in the European Union, the United States, United Nations, they all kind of push this globalist agenda, which to me is really about humanism, and it's about robbing us of our sovereignty and so forth. So, that is very, very concerning. I talk about in the deeper state, the political influence that we give people and how it gets corrupted. A lot of it by the people that are influencing the political class and the bureaucracies. And then, of course, I talk about the spiritual realm, the unseen realm, and the influence that demonic forces have within the political establishment and the bureaucracy, and how they're pushing, whether it's through the likes of a James Comey or a McCabe or, any number of political people. I heard the other day on the radio, someone said the deeper state or the deep state and Democrats are much the same. And it would appear when you consider, who is really dragging their feet and trying to undermine what President Trump is trying to do, it's the professional DNC in Washington that are doing things that arguably are against the interest of the entire United States, but it's promoting their own interests, whether it's Uranium One or it's a host of other issues that you've been reading on the front pages. The view, the very short-sighted view, it seems to me, of personal interest. Yes. And I guess all of us are guilty of that. That's the nature of the human condition, sin. What's in this for me, regardless of how it affects anyone else, seems to be, in the long run, rather self-destructive. Like, what was the joke that Lenin said? We'll sell the capitalists the rope with which they will hang themselves, or with which we will hang them. It seems that while the elites are making these deals, whether it's Uranium One or oil deals with the Middle East or whatever, that the longer game doesn't seem to be a good outcome for the home nation of these elites. I mean, where do they think their descendants are going to live when things finally come to a head? Yeah. I mean, what's their exit strategy here? Well, a number of them, many of them, are very much into eugenics. And
we've noticed
Ted
that.
Turner has made it very clear that he says that we ought to have a world of 500 million, not 8 billion. So, you can think very nefariously about what his ultimate outcome might be about most of us. And I'm sure that there are a number of us who would be on the front of the line on this type of activity.
It's, the eugenics people are always, they're never at the front of that line.
No, they believe in feudalism. They believe in dictating every aspect of our life. They are genetically predisposed, according to them, the elite, to rule the world, to make all the decisions. We are not capable of making the decisions for ourselves. So their world is very different than the world that I see. They're imbued with zeitgeist. In other words, the spirit of the time, progressivism. They're going to get to where they need to be, and we're going to pay the price. But they have the idea that humanity is going to improve until eventually we're perfect, but there are only a few left that fit that characterization.
Mm-hmm. And usually the ones who are making the characterization. Yeah. Well, how do the long-term goals of President Xi of China fit into the globalist agenda for what they want the world to be?
Well, keep in mind, he represents the majority of the Communist Party elite, who obviously are the elite of China, and therefore would be the elite of their future world. And so he is going to make China the economic powerhouse of the world. He's going to make everyone else, to bow basically at their doorstep to accommodate them economically. He will dominate all governments given the opportunity. He already has spies by the thousands and thousands in this country, robbing us blind of our intellectual property, manipulating our economy in ways. He's already made steps to make the yuan the currency that they're going to buy everything. In the past, it's been the dollar for petroleum. No longer, probably beginning next year, that's going to change because China's just not going to do it. And so they truly are stepping out across the world, doing things that only a few years ago nobody envisioned. And he is a very, very powerful man in a position for life. He'll be as powerful, if not more so, than Mao Zedong was. And Mao, of course, killed millions and millions of his own countrymen to bring them into alliance or obedience to his vision for the world.
This was an event that probably didn't get as much attention as it should have here in the United States. President Xi getting the constitution changed in China to become the ruler for life.
That's true. No, it's not well publicized, but it's a fact. It was well publicized over there. The people in Asia understand what this means. There's no secret. And he's already laid out, how things are going to be orchestrated. His dream ambition, as he's indicated, he's going to control basically the young population, bring them into like the Communist Party better, because they truly are the elite that ought to control everything, according to him. So there is an ideology behind him, and that has the complete support of the leadership of that country. And, my concern, of course, is that, as the world begins to bifurcate once again, that, the haves and have-nots are going to have to line up. And there's going to be a lot more alignment with China because of its economic prowess and its military might than any of us in this country ought to. We need to appreciate how important this is. Now, they are not without problems. They have some internal problems. We better get very bright at how to, manipulate that. And we also need to recognize that there are ways of doing things that, could really test our own staying power in the near future. This is a very difficult time ahead. And go ahead.
We've not talked much about yet Russia, the other main nuclear power in the world. And Vladimir Putin has essentially become ruler for life there. Even during the term of President Medvedev,
he was clearly the prime minister.
Yeah, Putin was clearly pulling the strings behind the scenes. So he has also been allowed a longer time frame in order to set policy and strategize than what most American presidents receive. Very famously, Barack Obama overheard on the microphone telling President Medvedev, if you just wait until after the election, I'll have more, which sort of is a window into the American political mindset. If we just get past the midterms, then we've got more latitude to move. China, Russia, not bound by those things. What's Russia's long-term goal? What is Putin trying to set up, and how does that affect what China and what the rest of the world are going to do?
Putin's an incredibly interesting guy. He will rule as long as he wants to.
Very popular inside Russia.
Probably he was elected by 77% of the popular vote. Whether it was fixed or not, it doesn't really matter. We're not going to do anything about it. He's surrounded by oligarchs that he made rich that do his dirty work. For instance, back in February this year, you had a couple hundred Russian mercenaries killed in eastern Syria. They were hired by a group that worked for a Russian oligarch, which is a dear friend of Vladimir Putin. So they weren't there by mistake. Putin has by his public statements, he has every intention of making Russia a great nation again. And the Russian people, by their own survey, want to be a great nation again. And they don't care how much it costs in terms of their own sacrifice. They want to be great again. The problem is they have an economy that's in the tank. They're totally dependent upon oil. Of course, oil income is about to go up again. We see prospects of maybe $100 a barrel. So that's going to hurt all of us here in America, even though we're producing a lot more oil because of fracking and the like.
Yeah, there are parts of the country that I used to travel where $100 a barrel oil would be great news. Southern Illinois, Western North Dakota,
That's good for the
Texas,
local economy.
Oklahoma, good for them. people who depend on it for long-haul trucking, farmers, not so good.
Not so good.
Yeah.
So Putin, meanwhile, though his economy has issues, he is, of course, expanding geopolitically into the Middle East. He's established himself in Syria. He's established himself, interesting, with Egypt, Turkey, which is a NATO ally, which they just agreed to build a nuclear reactor on the coastline on the Med. And, of course, they've sold an S-400 anti-ballistic missile system to the Turks, which violates agreements that we have with NATO. So Turkey is, I think, in limbo. They've, of course, worked very closely with the Iranians. Russia's reestablishing themselves there. They've already, of course, they keep the civil war going in Ukraine, and that's not going to end well. That's the breadbasket of Russia, Mother Russia, historically. And, of course, they've intimidated everyone up to the Scandinavian countries. And then, of course, they've controlled the stands. And then there's China, 4,000-kilometer common border. Those nations, they recently exchanged foreign ministers to, the new Chinese foreign minister went to Moscow and says, "Dear friend, we're going to work together. We're going to cooperate more than we ever have before," and so forth. So the relationship of necessity against us, we're the enemy. There's no question about it when you read their literature, is consolidating between Russia and China. Which is bad news. They've done this before, but not nearly to the extent that they are now doing it. So revisiting a new Cold War is my real concern. I see every indication of that.
Looking at the elites, the globalists who influence American policies here, it seems it's pretty much Americans and Europeans for the most part, North Americans and Europeans. The Russians and Chinese don't seem to be playing or willing to dance to our tune, as it were. How do their plans, and this potential new friendship, this renewal of the Cold War, how does that affect the plans of the globalists?
Well,
or is that just another aspect of their plan?
Well, it is, I think. You see, the Chinese understand this, and they are going to co-opt the Europeans, which they're already doing through a variety of purchases and by contract, and of course by intellectual property manipulation. So if you're truly a global trader, you have to have access to markets. China is going to control those markets, and as a direct result, you're either in their camp or not in their camp. If you're not in their camp, you're going to hurt financially in the market world. Just take, for example, why would China, a country that doesn't have any Arctic ice, have icebreakers?
That's a good question.
They have a fleet of icebreakers. Now, why? Because they have figured out to get to Europe, they need to go the northern route. They don't want to depend upon the Russians, and so they have icebreakers now to save on delivery to Europe. Now, of course, I've indicated that they are buying up a host of facilities in northern Europe. And as a direct result, you've got a few Europeans, Macron in France, May and a couple of others who are recognizing that maybe we shouldn't be surrendering so much to the Chinese because they do have a global ambition to begin to take over. So this oligarchy, there was a conference months ago in Beijing. They brought in all these Latin leaders. And these Latin leaders came in and they were being briefed by the telecommunication industry there in China. And they said, look, if you would like to have Wi-Fi and all the connections just like we do in Shanghai and so forth, we can do that. You turn over your economy to us, and we will give you all of this. Now, Turkey has done that. Latin American nations are incentivized to do it. Should they surrender, and some will, I predict, then you're going to have more Chinese influence over to our south, Latin American and Central American countries, much like you already have in many African countries, especially in the east coast of Africa. What do the Chinese want? They want access to all sorts of minerals, raw materials. They want marketplaces. They truly, if you look at what they're doing globally, want to take over. And like I say, it might be prudent to begin to learn to speak Chinese.
From a prophetic standpoint, again, the subtitle of your book the deeper state, refers to an imminent final empire. What does this final empire look like, and how do we as Christians fit into it?
To a certain degree, it depends upon what we as Americans, what we as Christians do in the future. You know, China has a rich Christian history, and they have a lot of Christians that are there today that are somewhat of a thorn in the side of President Xi.
Yes.
Xi's a communist. He doesn't believe in all this Christianity stuff. And so, you know, his primary threat internally is that there's going to be internal dissent. They have 1.3 billion people, and a lot of those people are not controlled like the Communist Party would like to. So I see internal dissent as a real possibility. That's something we, the West, ought to consider. We ought to seed that as much as we possibly can, because, you know, tearing it apart internally is absolutely essential if we're going to defeat this hegemonic ambition that they're expressing across the world. So we can do it secularly through government to a certain degree, but certainly praying for the salvation of a large part of the Chinese people would just turn that place upside down and give them the types of values and direction and long-term goals as they await the Savior.
And yeah, that's something that should be in all of our minds, rather than focusing on the political solution, is that ultimately this world conflict isn't going to be solved until Jesus Christ returns at the head of the heavenly host. Demographics. This is something that Pat Buchanan's been writing about for quite some time. I remember back in 2006, I had the opportunity to interview him about his book, The Death of the West, where he I'll use the word prophesied the decline and death of Europe, because we Caucasians are, both in Europe and in North America, are not having enough children to maintain our populations. It's the global South that is still growing. Everywhere else on the planet, even in Asia, East Asia especially, the Koreans and the Japanese are an aging population, population getting ready to decline, if not collapse. How does that factor into the way things play out? I mean, in other words, President Xi, President Trump, other global leaders may plan for a certain amount of economic growth per year, but if your population is shrinking, it's really hard to make those plans come to pass. How does demographics fit into all of this?
Yeah, it is a real challenge. You're right, especially in Europe, you have, replacement rates of 1.3, 1.4, when you really need a replacement rate in excess of 2. Yeah,
2.1 or so, yeah.
And, the same thing in Japan. So you get a graying population that the younger cohort cannot sustain through social services, medical and the like. And therefore, the jobs go to whoever is available. So one of the reasons the United States has grown to depend upon a lot of immigrants coming in is because our population replacement is declining.
Right.
And as long as you have a youthful population coming in that plays the game, that provides the tax base that funds the social services, then you're going to have a reasonably viable economy. The Chinese are because they have such a large economy and a large population, they're still having to wrestle with some of this. And so you see in the Southeast Asia where you have a youthful economy, or youthful population, and also in Africa and in other places, that's where a lot of the jobs are now going, because they'll work for less, because they've become accustomed, even in modern cities like Shanghai, to a much higher wage. So jobs are becoming more transient, which has an impact on your global competition and the bottom line of a country's ability to sustain the quality of life that they want. Everybody can't live at a high quality of life given the way in which the system of economics is put together today.
Yeah. In the United States, we like to think of ourselves as a free market, but it's really a hybrid free market socialist system.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
That's the nature of what we're dealing with here.
Yeah. I guess in the last couple of minutes of this program, what is your hope? When you write a lot about some of the real challenges facing us. I mean, the challenge of Islam was the focus of your book, Never Submit.
Right.
The transhumanist future and the changing nature of what it means to be human, in addition to the frightening nature of future wars, and then the deeper state, this occult underground that's trying to bring back Babel. What do you hope that Christian readers of your works take away from this? What message, what hope, what call to action do you hope that we get?
Well, we're called to be followers of Christ, to be students of God's Word, and to be subservient to God's Spirit as He directs us each day. You know, with regard to Islam, Islam has a very clear agenda to take over the world. Sharia law, that's what Osama bin Laden advertised. He wants to take over the world. We, as Christians, need to love the world to Christ. And we ought to be as energetic, but not in a violent way, and spreading the gospel of Christ. With regard to this transhumanist stuff that I talk about in the future war, you know, there are people out there that would make us into robots, that would, you know, put artificial things that we can't even control, that would, you know, create a world that is so alien from what we know today. That's not what Christ had in mind.
Yeah.
It's distorting the message of the gospel. It's distorting, you know, His intent for human mankind. So we need to resist that and hold government accountable to make sure it doesn't allow that to happen. In the deeper state, there is a very clear globalist agenda. There are those that would, you know, seek to, you know, change the direction of the world, to embrace a humanist agenda, to reduce the population through some very bad ways, to change the destiny of what we believe to be the right and just thing that the Lord has outlined in His Word. So there are a host of issues here, but to be faithful to the Lord in what He's called us to do, to follow His values and His principles, and to rely totally upon His Spirit, that's the sort of stuff that ultimately I'm talking about, and to look forward to the day of His second coming. Amen. And it will happen, and it will happen sooner than any of us actually realize.
I think you're right about that. As the Apostle Paul wrote, to put on a full armor of God. Absolutely. As a warrior, to stand and hold our ground until He comes back. Well, always appreciate your insight. It's you know, wonderful. Professional military man, yet who views the world through the lens of a Bible-believing Christian. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Maginnis. Check the show notes, whether at vftb.net, Spreaker, Stitcher, or if you're watching this at the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert, you'll find the notes below this video, and we'll have links there to where you can find Colonel Maginnis's books. The best deal, of course, you can get them at you know, the usual places, Amazon.com, but you get the best deal on them at the Skywatch TV store, because Tom Horn likes to make it worth your while to shop there as opposed to going to Amazon.com. So he throws in a lot of stuff that you wouldn't get anywhere else. So you'll find those links, again, in the show notes, vftb.net, and other places as well. In just a couple of weeks, Sharon and I will be heading, well, just a couple of weeks, in just a few days. By the time you see this, it'll be less than a week, flying to Israel for our tour, courtesy of Lipkin Tours. We will be touring Israel and then visiting Jordan for several days, along with Dr. Michael Heiser and his lovely wife, Drina. Don't know how well we'll be able to maintain a schedule with View from the Bunker for the next few weeks. We do have a program lined up for next Sunday, but beyond that, it's going to be kind of catch as catch can. We will try to record some programs while we're in Israel. We're certainly going to be shooting as much video as we possibly can while we're there. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and we are truly honored and blessed by this opportunity. Some of the sites that we will see above and beyond the sites that are of historical importance to Christians, Jews, relate specifically to the subject of the book that I'm working on, which should be out by August. So hopefully we'll be able to catch some video that we can offer as a to add a little extra insight into the subject matter of the book. So more on that once we get into the summer months and we get closer to actually releasing the book. Next week's program is going to be the result of some investigation on the ground by our friend L.A. Marzulli. He spent some time in Portugal recently. You know that he's been talking about the so-called miracle of the sun. In 1917, we passed the 100th anniversary of that last fall while we were in Boise. interesting how the conference just coincided with that 100th anniversary. But his research there indicates that there's a specific spirit perhaps at work in what happened at Fatima, Portugal, back in August of 1917. So we will, or rather October of 1917. Yeah, it wasn't Boise. It was Oklahoma City where the dates overlapped. So that's right, October of 1917 when the Fatima event took place. Anyway, that will be our discussion, our program next week, and you'll find it again at vftb.net, the YouTube channel, and everywhere else fine podcasts are sold. Our dance card for the year is filling up. Besides the tour of Israel and followed immediately by Rome and Sardinia with Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino, we will be at the Hear the Watchman conference in Long Island. Mike Kerr and Jeannie Moore gracious enough to invite us to come back and speak August 9th through 11th. That is at Ronkonkoma, Long Island. The Clarion Hotel and Conference Center at Ronkonkoma, Long Island. Henry Groover, Rabbi Zev Parat, Pastor Carl Gallups, Pastor Paul Begley, Pastor Casper McLeod, Ellie Marzulli, of course, Dr. Michael Lake, and others. Sharon and I will be there. And as a special bonus, on August the 12th, after a morning of baptisms, there will be a tour bus heading to Montauk. That's Camp Hero, the former Air Force base that inspired the hit Netflix series Stranger Things, because strange things happened at Camp Hero on Montauk. Worth seeing. And we will be your tour guides for that event on August the 12th. For information and registration, hearthewatchmen.com. That's hearthewatchmen.com. Transhumanism and the Hybrid Age. That's the theme of the True Legends Conference, which comes back to Branson in September 14th through the 16th of 2018. Sharon will be one of the featured speakers for that conference, along with Steve Quayle, Tom Horn, Dr. Hugo DeGaris, Timothy Alberino, David Knight of Infowars.com, and now Richard Dolan, respected ufologist, talking about transhumanism. Where is it leading mankind, and how is it being presented to us as an alternative religion? That conference date, September 14th through the 16th, the Mansion Theater in Branson. Don't wait. It is already 2/3 sold out. And then in October, we head to the East Coast again, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, for the East Coast Prophecy Conference from Southwest Radio Ministries. Dr. Larry Spargimino and Dr. Bob Glaze. Tom Horn will be one of the featured speakers. Stephen Strang, publisher of Charisma Magazine and the author of God and Donald Trump. I will be one of the speakers, and Joe Horn as well, the author of the new book, which you need to have at home, called Time Bomb. What you're eating may be killing you, even if you think you're eating healthy. Dates for that conference, October, why is my brain, 18th through 20th, I believe, are the dates. Yes, October 18th through the 20th. I'll put it on the screen here if you're watching this on the YouTube video, so if I've got that wrong, it'll be correct on the screen. But you'll get the correct information and registration at the website for Southwest Radio Ministries. That's swrc.com, swrc.com. Our Bible study available every week. That's the Gilbert House Fellowship, gilberthouse.org. We're going through the book of Ezekiel. We will take a 3-week hiatus while we're away. Again, we have no delusions of grandeur, illusions of being able to keep up a regular schedule while we are touring the Holy Land. So we won't get to the exciting Gog-Magog part until we return. But by then, we'll have seen some of the sites that I'll be writing about, because the Gog-Magog War is an important part of my forthcoming book. So, but in the meanwhile, you can catch up on all of the archives going back to Genesis 1:1. That's at gilberthouse.org. Please give us a review at iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, or wherever else fine podcasts are sold. And give us a like at Facebook, facebook.com/view from the bunker, which is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is by Kevin MacLeod. His website is incompetech.com. Our announcer is DC Good. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.